All right, so it's the SEC Growth Data Science staff meeting for March 8th, 2023. Phil, you're outside today. That's neat.
Yeah, it is. Hopefully it doesn't start raining on me. If it does, I'll run inside halfway through the meeting.
There you go. So happy fourth year GitLab anniversary, Thomas.
Y'all have been afflicted with me for a long time. So
Okay, there's some congrats also from Mon and Camille and Neil. In the 4 years is huge. So Thomas, you've got news item number 1.
Yep. All right. So this is from the development staff meeting agenda there, and the link is straight to the to that particular discussion thread. There's been some unplanned required stops with upgrades and DB migrations, and there's a bunch of links that are available here, including information about what the database team is doing, and there is an ask for other teams, which is below. And so there's the ask information here. I don't see Tiago, but he's his anecdote is additional, is worthwhile additional insight and context. So worth being aware of and knowing, particularly as we get into more database centric approaches.
Thomas, so in the hallway, I reviewed the values hierarchy again recently. It's worth taking a look if you haven't looked at it in a while. Click on that link there. I know we don't share screen very often, but I'll share screen on this. Is sharing a handbook page. Results. Good results enable us to keep doing the right things. That's the top of the pyramid. Iteration and transparency are the most noticeable from outside the organization. They're the second level, which also help to enable the third level of collaboration, diversity, inclusion, and belonging and efficiency. Those are the foundation of our values, but this is kind of how the hierarchy of the values come into play, because we can't always make a perfect decision on detail on what we're doing. So this helps us make a decision when we have to balance one against another, I think. And this is not a thou shalt kind of thing. This is guidance in general. So any impressions of this or thoughts on this? Sounds like no. Okay.
I'll ask a question. Sorry, it wasn't clear why you chose to share that today. Was there any particular reason?
Why? Good question, Phil. Because it often our values, you can't make a perfect decision. So in general, not about a specific situation recently, but often you can't make a perfect decision. Trying to get the best results with the best iteration, with the best transparency and collaboration and diversity, inclusion, belonging, and efficiency. You have to choose that some are going to be valued. Some are going to, you're going to do more on some than on others. And when needing to do that, it's worth keeping this in, kind of the hierarchy in mind, but not about any specific initiative or project or anything. I found it really useful. So I figured I'd say, and I don't think I'd read this since I onboarded this portion of the values portion of the handbook. And I read it again recently, like, aha, this helps put things in perspective. Does that answer your question, Phil?
It does. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. So Neil, you've got oh, go ahead, Jay.
I could chime in. Yeah, on the anti-abuse team, we notice like our projects are not open for public typically, and a lot of our communication is confidential. So I feel like we often make this sacrifice of transparency over results just because the work requires it to some degree. Debated potentially when having an epic, potentially actually making 2 epics, one which would be confidential and one which would not be, just so we could exercise that transparency. But yeah, just to reiterate, this is a sacrifice that our team usually has.
similar in vulnerability, other teams too, including vulnerability research. Sometimes what vulnerability research is working on is patentable. So we don't want to make it public until we're ready to, as an example. And there's transparency inside the company and transparency outside the company as well. We try to be transparent inside the company as much as possible. And also transparent outside the company as much as possible. But like I know, Jay, your team is very transparent inside the company, but not necessarily to the public based on what you work on. And it helps with your collaboration with the abuse team, that's responsible for the day-to-day of protecting GitLab. And it's useful for, collaborating with the growth team. Because often, growth changes can create risk for abuse, and abuse changes can create risk for growth. Like they're two sides of the same coin in some cases. So all that internal transparency is great, even if we can't be externally transparent. So it's good to bring up. Thomas?
I'll finish writing this in just a moment, but this whole note about what is private versus public, when we default to public for a lot of things, I've really found it quite interesting that we've codified Conway's law in that we are shipping transparent by default, and we actually have to make it's actually harder to have private conversations within the product because you have to have more steps in order to make it a confidential issue or merge request or things along those lines. So I actually think it's really neat to see how it's been codified, how value has been codified, and quite frankly, appreciate it. And so I'm not trying to contradict, but I've always been amused and interested and kind of amazed how some of these things sneak into the product that are a reflection of who we are. So anyway, I just thought it was neat. Wanted to share.
Neil, looks like you're up.
Yeah, thanks. So 360 feedback, I know it's not a timely discussion, but something we maybe start thinking about, especially, so the cycle normally starts in July, and I've linked off to the timeline on the handbook. Wayne, you have an OKR that talks about career development, feedback, and 360 feedback that I linked off to. So we're touching on that topic now. What I'd like the team to maybe start thinking about is a comprehensive, just all of us. I'm calling it Wayne's World. I think, Thomas, you invented that previously. I love it. But all the sections Wayne supports. But it's typically an opt-in. Last 2 years, I think, have been an opt-in process, kind of tied to our individual growth plan. So there's like a performance management, career development context as well, which could be kind of iffy for certain team members. What I like to think about again is if we all do that. Two big call out reasons would be, when I joined 3 years ago, we had a great thing. I got a lot of great feedback as a new employee from my peers. I was able to submit feedback to my peers. A lot of us haven't had that type of feedback in the last 2 years. And then we have a lot of new team members, hires and realignment team members that I think could really benefit from being able to provide and get feedback from their teams. So again, we're months out. I know there's other ways to conduct 360 feedback. I think, Wayne, you have a comment about that. I like the system a lot just because it's very structured.
Yeah, Phil brought to my attention earlier today, my time, at yesterday, his time, I think, that our timelines for 360 feedback cycles are not in Q1, but we have a Q1 OKR that mentions doing 360s. Those two things are not consistent. So another way to do a 360, if somebody wants to, again, totally optional, is informally do an anonymous Google form, which anybody can set up. Anonymous is the configuration option in a Google form versus required authentication. Invite peers and a manager and stakeholders and just have 3 questions, open-ended questions. What should I continue doing? What should I start doing? What should I stop doing? And you can get really great feedback that way with those kinds of very simple questions.
That's a great option. So we'll go back and update the KR for Q1 to make it clear that that's an option for this. I think so. Neil's suggesting that later in the year, potentially we make this compulsory. Is that right, Wayne? Neil, sorry.
Yeah, that's correct. I think, Wayne, I love your suggestion. I think a Google form is a great way. Again, it's opt-in. It's voluntarily based. That's not a bad thing, but it's not going to include everybody. I don't know if it's an inclusive approach. It's more of if you want to do it, I just don't know. Again, like I've seen the last couple of years, I think you did a survey last year, Wayne, Was that 6-8 months ago? I feel like you did a survey to see
Like,
who in your
Culture Amp
team.
does a better job than this. A more thorough job than these questions and how they organize it and the better user interface. But this is still I actually prefer this for myself. I think I still use Culture Amp, but I don't know why I use Culture Amp if I prefer this, but I prefer this. But it's just I get a better response rate. With these and more insightful feedback because it's shorter perhaps than what we do in Culture Amp. And I also
Definitely is.
probably more importantly, I direct message people. Hey, I'd love your feedback. Here's an anonymous Google form in Slack versus Culture Amp, which I think sends an email or maybe Slack messages too, but it's from a bot or an account you don't recognize versus someone you do. So maybe I just get a better response rate due to that.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the notion if we're all doing it. Plus, there's an efficiency gain too. If we're doing these kind of one-off, people have to get used to how to submit feedback in the appropriate manner. That can be like an experience I've gone through many times. I recognize the first one or two. I'm like, okay, I'm doing this. I haven't done this for a while. And then those last ones, I'm like, wow, I'm getting good at this. It's like anything you do repeatedly. And I do appreciate that with the Culture Amp cycle. I appreciate the response rates. We've all seen we're not getting the full people giving us feedback. We request 8 or whatever people, we end up getting 5 or 6. That's still going to happen, but just another anecdote on my experience. We will ignore that, Thomas. I think it's been the last 2 years.
Yeah, I think it's been optional as far as I can remember. But I may not remember back far enough. Like if you make people do a 360 and they don't want to, that's not a good feel, right? Then they're gonna feel it's prescribed to them and they don't want to do it, which is not a good feeling for anybody, or they might do it and ignore it. So I'm glad we make it optional for folks who get value out of it, and optional for people not do it if they don't want to do it. In the OKR, it says do a 360 feedback, or what's the other option per team member?
Training?
Self-directed training.
Self-directed training. So I mean that's another option too. It's about growth, right? This OKR is about individual growth, 2 different potential ways to do it. There are others too, but self-directed training or do a 360.
Just a question on timing then. Because I think we've also got an OKR around creating growth plans for all team members, and shouldn't the feedback cycle and 360 review and the feedback that comes off that go into that growth plan as well? So rather than creating a growth plan now and then doing 360 review later, switching that order around.
I'd say do what makes most sense to you based on all of this. Definitely flexible on what, to do what makes most sense based on where we're at and where your team is at, et cetera, Nate.
So reading through the handbook, Nathan, for the team members that want to opt in to 360 feedback are required to have an individual growth plan beforehand. I agree, do what works best, but per the guidelines, our handbook describes it as a prerequisite.
Does it talk about updating it afterwards? I haven't had a chance to read through the handbook page.
I'll share my screen now. So yeah, team members who want to opt into the 360 feedback, there's a couple optional steps and then a couple required steps. This is the one I was mentioning. I may be misinterpreting this. If I am, I apologize. And then your question, is there a discussion about updating the growth plan? You would expect that, right? Because that's good information. I'm not seeing that as far as the requirements. There's definitely, it's a really long cycle. Starts in July, concludes halfway through September. It's like 2.5 months. And then guess what happens right about here? We start talking about end of year assessment. So.
But that is the benefit of this process. If for team members who want to do it, it sets you up so well for talent assessment at the end of the year. There should be no surprises because you've been working with your manager, you've been getting feedback, you've been working on those action plans. Yeah.
So Mon couldn't make it today, but of course that's fine. All meetings are optional. She did have some discretionary bonuses. So I am going to go find those and summarize them. I just had them and now I don't. Are those usually announcing what's happening at GitLab or elsewhere?
The team member updates.
Team, I always get those two. I always conflate those two in team member updates. Thanks, Neil. So two of them were actually nominated by me. So I'm familiar with those, but I'm not going to read all the details. But Alexander was nominated, as was Albert, for helping with the data analysis for merge requests for our SOX audit. Very much appreciated there. They jumped in and helped in various ways. And then Mon also did that. Bruno Cardoso received discretionary bonus for contribution to solving and brainstorming ghost users for smart issue labeling using machine learning. He analyzed the root cause of the issue and took initiative to solve and drive the solution, and planning to automate retraining of the model, which is pretty cool. So another friendly plug for all of us to use, when appropriate, discretionary bonuses to recognize people, and also, if it's not discretionary bonus worthy, the thanks channel as well for us, between each other, between our teams, and with others outside of our own teams as well. Overall, good stuff. Okay, I think that's all we had for today. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.